Hi, I'm Justin. Welcome back to Just Shaves. For this video, I'll be providing a deep dive and spotlight of the new RazoRock Recurve razor. The one I have is the 1mm gap, and I'll actually be doing a side-by-side comparison against the RazoRock Game Changer with the 1.05 millimeter blade gap as well. I did want to just focus on this Recurve, but between the two razors, I was just kind of curious how they would compare. So I will be doing a side-by-side, but I wanted to focus this deep dive just on this RazoRock Recurve. So I did want to just highlight a little bit behind this design, what they were trying to accomplish, and highlight some of the things they did really well, in my opinion. Quick shout out to Fred Winterburn for dreaming up this concept. He's another razor enthusiast, and supposedly a couple years ago when he was on a camping trip, he just kind of dreamt up this concept of putting a double bend in the razor blades, drew up a few sketches, and he sent them over to the RazoRock team for them to kind of do what they wish and run with it. And a couple years later, they ended up coming up with this razor here. So again, with double-edged razors, there's only so many designs out there. Whenever folks are bold enough to actually create innovations, I just want to tip my hat to them. So huge shout out to Fred Winterburn and also to the RazoRock team for making this razor. So little bit behind how this razor is designed and what they're trying to accomplish. This all comes down to blade rigidity. So with double-edged razor blades, very thin in nature and are prone to bending and flexing if they're not properly supported. And that's what leads to unpredictable cuts and irritation, blade chatter where the blade's kind of skipping along your skin. Really, any razor that's going to work well has to figure out a way to make the blade rigid as it's contacting your hairs. Typically, there's two methods or approaches that modern razors seem to take these days. One is just clamping the blade, where it sounds just like what it is. The top cap and the base plate are really combining to hold the blade down, really right up to the furthest edge of the blade to minimize that chatter. There's a few razors out there that do that pretty darn well. One of the limitations with that design is that if it's relying upon that base plate underneath to provide support, it kind of limits the options the razor designers have in terms of setting up, the blade gap and blade exposure any way they want. If they make a razor and it's really successfully holding down the blade, they might not want to be able to try to tweak the base plate settings because you might lose support as you're doing that. So that's really the primary limitation with razors that clamp the blade well, is it's often a little bit more challenging to set up the razor to have, mild, efficient, different settings with the razors. The other approach that we commonly see is called, blade bending, which the top cap is going to kind of force the blade down and put tension on the blade. That way, once it gets to the cutting edge, the blade's already under enough tension that it's rigid at the point. The razors that do this pretty well, some of my favorites are the Ollyworks Meteorite, also the Blackland Blackbird. Both those razors bend the blade down to create that tension. And because it's under tension, the base plate underneath doesn't need to provide quite as much support. And it gives the razor designers a little bit more flexibility in terms of how they want to set up the blade gap and blade exposure to accomplish whatever they want the razor to accomplish. And with those two examples, the Meteorite and the Blackbird, both of those actually have different base plate options where they're offering different blade gap and exposure combinations to accomplish what they want. So overall, one of the benefits of having a razor that bends the blades, you have more flexibility with how you set up the settings on the razor. The downside is oftentimes it creates a bulkier head because you have to allow enough space to bend the blade down in the actual razor head. That's exactly where this Recurve comes in. So what it's doing here is it's kind of bending a lowercase m into the blade, where there's bending down in the middle and then back down at the edge of the blade. This is creating that same tension of a really well bent blade, but it's with a very thinly shaped head profile. And I really love how RazoRock did this razor. It looks very reminiscent of the RazoRock Lupo, where it's covering the blade tabs and angling back. This is probably the slimmest profiled razor that I've ever used. And again, with how it's being set up, it's not so reliant upon the underneath base plate for support. The RazoRock was actually able to set this up with a few different options just by swapping out the the positioning of the safety bar on the base plate. So this was part of what they're calling their Founder Series. Really what they're doing is a small batch release. They're still sold it for $100 a unit, but they released it under the Founder Series, just limiting the number of people it's going to, and then they're soliciting feedback on how it's performing so they can make tweaks once they make a larger batch run. They ended up releasing this with 5 base plate options. That's one of the things I really love about RazoRock and also dislike, is it's kind of challenging to know exactly which one's going to work best for you, because there's so many options. But again, options are generally a good thing for our community. So again, I'll tip my hat to them for that. But they ended up releasing this with 5 base plate options. Their most mild one, they had a 60 millimeter gap with a 0.025 blade exposure, which slightly positive. They also had an 80 millimeter gap with that same 0.025 positive exposure. And then they had an 80 plus that had the same 80 millimeter gap, but then it had a 0.127 blade exposure. It was, really positive blade exposure. And then their 1 millimeter gap option, they actually made this one with a neutral blade exposure. So this has the largest gap, but then has less blade exposure than the other options. And then they released also a 100 plus. It has the same 100 millimeter gap. And then I forget the blade exposure on that one. That's 0.102. Of the 5 options, I had my eyes on the 80 plus just because I thought all the blade exposure would end up working really well. But like all things, your mileage may vary. It's really difficult to compare razors on paper just off of blade gap and blade exposure, and trying to figure out what would work for you. When they released this, I kind of sat on it for a day or two trying to guess which one I was going to want. Decided upon the 80 plus, and then by the time I went back, it was already sold out. And by the time I decided on which other one I was going to want, also sold out. So I ended up buying the 80 plus secondhand from someone off of eBay. Gave that a try, loved how smooth and efficient it was. However, I did pick up on quite a bit of post-shave irritation for myself. It was kind of reminiscent of the RazoRock Lupo, where just with that added blade exposure, my skin kind of struggled with it. And I found a friend online that was willing to trade me my 80 plus base plate for his 100 base plate. So increased the gap, but then went to a neutral blade exposure. This one ended up working a lot better for me. The 80 plus was more efficient, but then this one was able to allow me to escape my shaves with a lot less irritation. So with that, I am going to jump into a side-by-side comparison shave. Overall, when I was using the 1 millimeter gap, it felt reminiscent of the RazoRock Game Changer, whereas that the 80 plus reminded me of the RazoRock Lupo, which didn't end up working out as well for me. So I know there's going to be some similarities between this and the Game Changer, but I kind of just wanted to do the comparison shave here. And most importantly, I wanted to highlight and provide some context behind this razor here. So I'm going to pause right here. I'll get lathered up for my first pass. All right, I'm back and all lathered up for my first pass. Going to be using a fresh Tweet Platinum blade in both razors. And actually, to minimize the amount of variables, I'm gonna have them sharing the same RazoRock Halo handle and also the same blade. One of my gripes with this recurve is it actually came with the long version of this Halo handle. So it was a long handle and they hollowed out the inside. I immediately hated it. Like, I thought the handle was way too bulky for how slim this head was. Anyways, I ended up trading that over to a buddy as well, and I'll just be sticking with RazoRock's standard Halo handle. Most of the weight's going to be coming from the handle. In this configuration, this comes in at 101 grams. The RazoRock Game Changer was spot on, so there shouldn't be any variables with the weight, assuming I use the same handle. But let's jump right into it. Again, this is the RazoRock 1 millimeter gap with the neutral exposure, and I'll start it off on the right side of my head. And this is just a very smooth and predictable razor. Quite a bit of efficiency still, just with the 1 millimeter gap. And then also really massive lather channels that don't seem to clog whatsoever at all. This is just a very easy razor for me to pick up, yet there is some efficiency here. And there's some blade feel, but not as much as I would have expected for the 1 millimeter of blade gap it has. And it sounds like RazoRock is going to be releasing a bunch of different base plate options once they end up making this more of their mass-produced razor. Just kind of taking feedback from some of the shavers that tested out this Founder Series version. But honestly, I'm actually quite pleased with this 1 millimeter gap. We'll switch over to the back of the head now. I think the 80 plus was more efficient, but of course it came at the expense of my post-shave irritation being a little bit higher. So it would have ended up just being a razor I only used some of the time. Yeah, awesome. Okay. So I'm gonna cut over to the RazoRock for the left side of my head. And again, because I'm having them share the handle and the blade, I'm actually just gonna pause for a second to take them apart. With the Game Changer, one of my least favorite things are that the posts are on the actual base plate itself. So assembling the razor just a little backwards compared to everything else. But in my couple of years of having a Game Changer, I haven't cut myself, so let's keep that streak going. And now we have the Game Changer. Highlighted this one before, covers the blade tabs, but does not angle back to just where the blade is. Just a simpler design. And this is the 1.5 gap. The .84 was one of my favorite razors. On some days it felt like too much, and I opted for trying out the .76. And .76 I think is a little bit more user-friendly. And as I got a little bit more experience, I actually wanted to try this .05. And to my surprise, probably just as smooth as the 84, just with a little bit added efficiency. So again, this is another razor I'm a really huge fan of. Cost-wise, you can get a RazoRock Game Changer for, I just checked this morning, they're going for about $60 right now, which again, for a stainless steel razor, I don't know if there's a better bargain out there. Dollar for dollar, this is the best stainless steel option I've seen. So I stayed away from this 1.05 gap for the longest time just because I knew the 84 was already so efficient. I just kind of assumed that this would be too much razor for me, but it actually works pretty great for me. And now this is just the razor I just enjoy having the options for. Again, $60 for just one, but if you buy individual base plates, you're looking at like 30 to 35, depending on if you get an open comb version or not. But even then, with having all 4 plates, this is a lot more affordable than a lot of other options out there. So really solid first pass from both razors. I'll pause right here and I'll get relathered. All right, I'm back and all lathered up for my second pass. Key takeaway, comparing the Game Changer against the Recurve, really difficult to tell them apart. A lot of similarities both in how they feel during the shave, and I think closeness was, after one pass anyways, felt very similar. On paper, I was expecting the Game Changer to have a little bit more just because, not so much because of the extra blade gap. We're comparing 1 millimeter to 1.05, which I don't think is very significant, but the Game Changer does have a positive blade exposure, whereas the 1mm recurve was neutral. So I was expecting a little bit more efficiency to that. At least during the shave, I didn't really pick up any differences in terms of blade feel, at least. But let's jump right back into it. I'll start on the back of my head. And this is the Game Changer 1.05, and I'm keeping it on the left side of my head. And excellent lather channels on the straight bar Game Changer. So again, little blade feel on the Game Changer. A huge part of that is just the massive blade gap of this 1.05. This is the most aggressive of the RazoRock Game Changers. If you like milder razors, the 0.76 or even the 0.68 gap might be a better option, but I kind of thought it would be fun to have this in my collection as well. All right, so done on the Game Changer side. Gonna switch back to the recurve. And have them sharing the blade and the handle. And I did hear some complaints with the recurve about, really needing to tighten down to get the blade secure. I haven't had any issues with it, and there's also little ridges on the side for you to hold on to while you do it. So if anybody had any concerns, not an issue for me. Awesome. And as I'm going down the back of my head, I might say that this 1mm recurve is just a little bit smoother than the Game Changer, but they're in the same ballpark. All right, I'm back with my final thoughts. Overall, the comparison shave, this one's tough to call. I think I ended up picking two good razors to compare. Efficiency, I'd probably give the slightest edge to the Game Changer 1.05. Not so much for the blade gap, but I think the positive exposure helped just a little bit with the efficiency. And then the neutral exposure of the recurve, I think, helped with the smoothness and comfort during the shave. So overall, I'm kind of nitpicking between those two. At ending shave was so close, I'd be able to call it a draw. Other factors to consider: price, dollar for dollar, I'd give it to the Game Changer. I do think that's one of the best value stainless steel razors out on the market. $60 for the whole razor, and you can add on different base plate options for just $30 and kind of set up a whole system where you have a mild option to all the way up to the aggressive 1.05. And then this recurve, I think, wins on the coolness factor. This design hasn't been seen yet, and it allows this razor to have the slimmest profile out there. As a head shaver, having a really slim profile isn't a top priority, but I know those who are shaving under the nose and doing detailing work, this would be a fantastic razor, because again, I haven't seen a razor with a slimmer profile. But for this particular comparison, I'd call it a draw, but this one wins on the coolness factor. RazoRock, hopefully they're able to get this back to the market really soon, hopefully with some more fun options as well. So overall, I'd call this a draw, but the coolness factor, I gotta give it to this recurve. It's a really fantastic design. I'm excited to see what RazoRock does with it going forward. But with that, we'll call this job well done. I'll catch you guys on the next one.